Innate immunity, inflammation as a barrier. With innate immunity having different lines of defense, with physical barrier, physiologic barrier, endocytic and phagocytic barrier, leading to finally what is called as a barrier that is because of inflammatory response. And all the four barriers together are responsible for ensuring that the innate immune system is able to eliminate a foreign particulate matter. Moreover, the inflammatory process or response involves cells that can also activate the adaptive immune system to ensure that there is a more specific immune response against a specific antigen. So let us look at the learning outcomes of this session. The role of inflammation is to combat infection and tissue injury through effector cells, pattern recognition receptors, and their oligomerization. So many pathogen recognition receptors or pattern recognition receptors come together to form large complexes, and on forming large complexes they are able to initiate a signaling cascade that can enable bringing a lot of leukocytes to a particular region, thereby getting a heightened response. The inflammatory response thereof is a sequence of events with immune responses having very specific features. These events lead to four cardinal signs of inflammation. There are several chemical mediators such as acute phase proteins, histamines, prostaglandins, etc., that lead to vascular alterations. So, here, what you mean by vascular is basically looking at the blood vessels. Diapedesis, chemotaxis, leukocyte mediated clearance are all phenomena that are commonly associated with inflammatory responses. So let us look at the events in inflammatory response that give rise to four cardinal signs. So let us say, for example, take into consideration over here uh, a tissue damage that say may have happened because of a thorn. Now, when you have tissue damage, that damage is going across the barrier, that is the outer barrier, and therefore now there is a portal of entry for microbes. Now, what is interesting to note is that the tissue damage and the influx of the bacteria into the tissue results in release of several vasoactive and chemotactic factors, and these vasoactive and chemotactic factors are able to trigger a local response. So when you say local response, that means the neighboring blood vessels around this area are getting constricted. So the smooth muscles of the blood vessels get constricted, and because of that, what happens is there is a flow of blood only towards this tissue region. So, therefore, the redness, which is one of the cardinal signs of inflammation, is because of the rush of blood towards this region. So, you have all the RBCs, WBCs, etc., all flowing through towards this, and therefore, at this point, you will find that it is becoming red. What also happens, and so this process of having fluid as well as you having the blood flow towards this particular site due to the presence of certain chemical mediators is what is called as vasodilation. So vasodilation is basically when you have um, the diameter of the blood vessel increasing, okay, it is called as vasodilation, and the diameter is increasing because you have the blood flow more into that, and the blood flow is more into that because the smooth muscles surrounding the blood vessel get constricted, thereby engorging the capillary. And Because of that, what happens is you have a heat also generated due to these all accumulation of fluid, etc., in this time. Now, what also is important to note over here is that in the process, it also leads to capillary permeability. That is, the blood vessel becomes more permeable. And because the blood vessel becomes more permeable, what is observed is fluid from the blood vessel gets into the tissue space. So this is basically that it allows an influence, it allows an inflow of fluid, and that fluid, which is the exudate, can contain a lot of proteins from the blood, like for example the complement proteins, the antibody, the acute phase proteins, etc. They can all get exudated from the blood vessel into the tissue space. So this is something that happens because of increased capillary permeability. And another phenomenon that happens is that the cells of the blood, which includes the leukocytes, especially the leukocytes, the leukocytes are able to bind or adhere the uh, epithelial lining of the blood vessel, and that is because of the interaction of the adhesion molecules present on both the epithelial cells and the leukocytes. Now this binding of the WBCs to the lining of the blood vessel is what is called as margination. And at a point, because of several interactions of the adhesion molecules, you would have the WBCs, or you'll have the leukocytes squeeze out through the blood lining, blood vessel, and that process of squeezing out of or squeezing out of the blood cell into the tissue is what is called as extravasation or diapedesis. Now, because you have a lot of exudate getting accumulated here, you have a high amount of protein and a lot of cells from the blood entering this area, you would find that there is swelling in this area because of fluid accumulation. So, in technical terms, it is also called as edema. Now, what is happening after this is that because of the presence of the phagocytes, so when you have the cells from the blood entering the tissues, these phagocytes get further attracted towards the site of injury or towards where you have a large population of microbes through a process that is called as chemotaxis. And once it is close to the microbes or the tissue damaged region, these also would be able to recognize um, uh, the molecular patterns present on the pathogens, and also the damage associated molecular patterns on the tissue, on the damaged tissue. And because of that, there would be phagocytosis. So the phagocytosis is something that is very obvious in an inflammatory response, and all these three, the redness, the heat generated, and the swelling that is happening in this tissue region, is leading to pain. There is going to be pain because here you have a lot of heat generated because of phagocytosis, because of fluid accumulation, because of um, because of stretching of the tissues, etc. And so there is a lot of pain that is associated at this point. Plus, you will have a lot of pus cells being formed, and with the pus cells being formed, you have pain. So the last cardinal sign of the inflammatory response is therefore pain. So let us look at the four cardinal signs again. Redness is because of inflow of the blood only to this region. I mean heightened flow of blood to this region due to vasodilation, heat generated because of the flow of all the cells, proteins, etc., to this area, increased capillary permeability, leading to accumulation of fluid in the tissue, that is edema, and of course, phagocytosis by the WBCs, leading to the fourth cardinal sign, which is called the pain. Now, let us look at the cells and the mediators in the inflammatory response. So whether you take dendritic cell or mast cell, whether you take plasma proteins, whether you take look at all the cytokines, chemokines, etc., that is released by these cells, they are all together responsible for inflammatory process. So when you have histamines, prostaglandins, nitric oxide, etc., being released in the process, you have them acting on the blood smooth muscle to cause vasodilation. So you can see how the histamine, the nitric oxide, and the prostaglandin is acting as chemical mediators to ensure vasodilation happens. Histamine and leukotrienes also lead to increasing the capillary permeability, allowing the plasma proteins and the leukocytes to leave the vessels, which is what we understand by diapedesis. You have the cytokines being released and adhesive proteins being released, which are responsible for migration and extravasation, that is diapedesis. Of course, you have the neutrophils, the dendritic cells, the macrophages, which are the professional phagocytes, leading to removal of foreign particulates by the process of phagocytosis, and also they secrete cytokines, and these cytokines in turn are able to mediate and adaptive immunity. So all in all put together, these are cells which are either professional phagocytes or non-professional phagocytes, but they together along with a lot of proteins, a lot of signals are able to carry out an inflammatory response. Of course, at the onset, what is the most important is the pattern recognition receptors. They are the ones that are actually eventually giving rise to an inflammatory response. So it is PRR that triggers the inflammation. Now, we all know that there are several different types of pattern recognition receptors, a few of which is what is again covered over here. Like for example, you have the toll-like receptors, and you will find several different prototypes of the toll-like receptor, and they are giving rise to what is called as the toll pathway. Now over here you can very clearly see that you have an extracellular domain, you have a membrane spanning domain, and you have a cytoplasmic domain. So when you have the TLR binding to a molecular pattern on a pathogen, you will have a change in conformation in the extracellular domain, which will in turn lead to a change in the intracellular domain, and that will lead to a chemical signal, or that will lead to a signal cascade. That is with respect to toll-like receptor. Now there are toll-like receptors. Now you also have soluble pattern recognition receptors. So for example, you have rig-like receptors, you have nod-like receptors, you have DNA sensors. All of them are present in the cytoplasm. And when you have these cytoplasmic receptors are able to interact with the molecular pattern on the microbes, thereby giving rise to a certain specific immune response. Now, this is just an overview on how the different microbes that are there are able to induce signaling through the pattern recognition receptors. So, for example, viruses have glycoproteins on their surface, or their DNA or their RNA can actually interact with the toll-like receptors and activate nod-like receptors and the DNA sensors to give rise to a particular immune response. Gram-positive bacteria can interact again with toll-like receptors through its DNA, through its lipoproteins, through its peptidoglycan, etc. Through its teichoic acid, all of these are able to interact and give rise to an inflammatory response. So in the gram-negative bacteria as well, you have DNA, you have porins, you have peptidoglycan, you have the lipopolysaccharide. These all are molecular patterns that are recognized by the toll-like receptors. So fungi and protozoa are also recognized by different toll-like receptors. In all, what we understand, therefore, is any type of foreign particulate organism, whether it is a virus, a gram-positive bacteria, a gram-negative bacteria, a fungi, or protozoa, they are all recognized by the pattern recognition receptors that are present in myriad cells in the innate immune system. And this is how they would eventually lead to an inflammatory response. So let us make the conclusions. The recognition of pathogens by pattern recognition receptors is a trigger for innate immune system, of which inflammatory response is an inherent process. The recognition by the pattern recognition receptors leads to release of vasoactive and chemotactic components, which in turn leads to increased flow of blood and capillary permeability. This in turn leads to migration and extravasation of plasma proteins and leukocytes from blood into tissues, from where, through chemotaxis, the professional and non-professional phagocytes would move towards the microbes. All these events lead to the region of infection becoming red, hot, swollen, and painful, which are the four cardinal signs of inflammation. Therefore, reiterating that rubor, calor, tumor, and dolor feature in the act of inflammation. These are signs of a fight ensued to eliminate an outsider, and for that matter, any outsider, because it is non-specific. The process is orchestrated by a team of cells, molecular patterns, and chemical mediators. So it is a team effort that leads to elimination of a foreign particulate matter by an inflammatory response. Thank you.